Welcome back. We arrived at the third final panel of our conference, titled Israel at War. Let me introduce our panelists. Orji Szakar, Dr. Tamás Péter Baranyi, Dr. Attila Novák, and Dr. László Csicsman. Let's also welcome Robert C. Castell and Matthew Lewitt, who could not join us in person, however sent their video messages from Israel and Washington. The panel will be moderated by Professor Jeffrey Kaplan.
All right, let's begin with the video that was sent by Robert Castell. I think you'll find it and the location from which it was filmed very interesting. Shall we begin?
Hello. I guess that I should start my presentation by wishing you a very good evening and a fruitful conference. I'm in a very strange position because I have to talk about the Gaza war 7 days before the planned conference, and I have no idea what will be the situation on the ground 7 days from today. Now I'm in the general area of Kibbutz Nirim. At my back, we can see the Wadi Gaza, Nahar Psor, which is the same river that divides the northern part of the Gaza, the two northern governorates from the two southern governorates of Gaza, and this is the route by which the IDF penetrated the Gaza area, the Gaza Strip, and cut it in two. So I planned to make my presentation from this very important position. The time is Friday, the 24th of November. We are several hours into the ceasefire, and hopefully I am praying to God that in an hour and a half that our first hostages will be liberated. So when I thought about the topics of my presentation, I decided to put aside everything that looks into the future, which we all know that 7 days in a time of war is basically eternity. And I would like to talk about the past. And talking about the past, I would like to answer two questions. The first question is, how did this strategic surprise happen? How and why succeeded Hamas surprising Israel? And the second question I would like to answer is, why? Why this war? How can we explain this war? Perhaps we'll start by answering the second question. I would like to start to answer the second question, and then I will switch to the first question I have asked. So why this war? Why this war now? And I think that in order to answer this question, we have to address it at three distinct levels. The first level is the global geopolitical level. The second level is the regional level. And the third level is the local bilateral level, the long-term conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. So at the global level, the first thing that must be said about this war broke out because the deterrence of the West collapsed. It collapsed. We have seen this collapse of the deterrence of the West in the Russian-Ukraine war too. And then the question that I have asked myself, if we are talking about a collapse of the regional deterrence or a general deterrence. Now, what we have seen here on October the 7th, we have seen that in yet another region, the collective deterrence of the West collapsed. So what all this says about the other regions, Taiwan, for instance, is anybody's guess. My impression is that the general deterrence of the West has weakened. Perhaps it didn't collapse entirely, but it was weakened in a very significant way by several different reasons. And we will see the consequences of this general weakening in other theaters too. So this is one reason. The other reason is the change in the world order that we are talking about during the last 2 years very much. And we can see that the United States, which is a global power, but acts very much like a regional power in every region it dominates as a regional power. And we are seeing a lack of a comprehensive and coherent U.S. Global strategy. We can see it, for instance, in the policy of the U.S. toward Iran. At one hand, we are lamenting the fact that Iran is supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine, and we are lamenting the fact that Iran tries to push out, to evacuate the U.S. influence from the Middle East, but at the other hand, the appeasing of the Iranian power that has started with President Obama goes on undisturbed. It goes on undisturbed. So this lack of coherence in the U.S. global strategy is another reason that this war broke out. On this another global reason. And the third reason is that we have very many challengers in the different regions. We have seen Russia, we have seen China, we have seen Iran, and perhaps we'll see other challengers too that sense this lack of coherence of the U.S. strategy and senses it as a weakness, and it tries to exploit it. So this is the global explanation why this war broke out. The regional explanation is what I have already mentioned. This conflict, this long crypto war between the United States and Iran from 1979, from the Iranian Revolution. We have seen this war, and we have seen very few occasions when the United States pushed back. It was the praying mantis operation ordered by Ronald Reagan, sinking a third of the Iranian Navy, and we have seen the liquidation of General Qasem Soleimani by President Trump. But besides this, the United States did very, very, very little to push back against this Iranian offensive, and this war in Gaza was just another Iranian provocation in a long line of provocations against the presence and the dominance of the United States and its allies in the Middle East. Now, on the local level, on the bilateral level between Israel and the Palestinians, there are two competing schools of thought. One school of thought insists that the reasons are internal, are Palestinians. Simply the Palestinians sense that with this tsunami of normalizations between Israel and the Arab countries, the Palestinian questions was pushed aside. Was pushed aside. The Arab countries do not want anymore to sacrifice their own interests for the sake of the Palestinians, and they did everything to return the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian problem, to the table, to the forefront of the global attention. This is one explanation. Another explanation why now is a more general one. The Palestinians reacted to the coming normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and they desperately start to stop it. And this was the reason. This was the reason for doing it. And there is a third explanation, that what they wished to do, that they hoped to initiate a kind of chain reaction by attacking Israel, then provoking a violent backlash by Israel, which in its turn will provoke the internal ring of fire, as General Qasem Soleimani defined it. And this internal ring of fire is made up by the Palestinians of Judea and Samaria, of the West Bank, as it is called in English, the Arabs of Israel. They will rise up, and they will make the life of Israel much harder. And this in turn, Israel's reaction to this will initiate a second chain reaction by drawing in the external ring of fire made up of Hezbollah, the Iranian-supported militias from Syria, Iranian-supported militias from Iraq, the Houthi from Yemen, and the combined effort of the two rings of fire will collapse the Zionist enterprise. So this was the most ambitious hope of the Palestinians, perhaps, and this is the most ambitious explanation of why now. So until now, we have answered the first question, why this war and why now? Now I have a more difficult task. I will have to answer the question, why this surprise? How this strategic surprise come into being? Now let's proceed to the more difficult task of explaining why this surprise became possible. Why and how? And I believe that in order to answer this question, we have to address it at 4 different levels. The first thing that must be mentioned, that a surprise at a strategic level is a subdiscipline. Those who deal with military theory and strategic studies regard it as a subdiscipline, and we are studying it as a collection of case studies, Pearl Harbor, the Barbarossa attack, the Yom Kippur War, and now this surprise attack are case studies well known in this subdiscipline. And there are great many explanations that explain why intelligence organizations keep failing again and again. Now, these explanations belong mostly to the realm of sociology, psychology, social psychology, organizational science, and similar disciplines. And I think that what we have seen here is not something not terribly different from what we have seen in the other well-known case studies, Pearl Harbor, Barbarossa, the Yom Kippur War. We have seen the same, more or less the same problem, the same pathologies of intelligence collection and the intelligence organization. And there is, it's very sad to say, but there is some banality of the failure here. There are so many ideas floating around regarding the failures of the Israeli intelligence, the over-reliance on technological means of collection, and hybris and overconfidence and arrogance by the higher echelons. I don't want to repeat all these explanations. I believe that most of these explanations are right on their mark, and the only argument that can be made, we can argue about the different proportions that they have contributed to this failure. So this is the professional level, and I think that the failures at this level has to be answered. I firmly believe that a divisional commander, that a divisional intelligence officer doesn't need direct orders from the prime minister or from the minister of defense in order to collect information and to kick and scream if the upper echelons doesn't react to the information reflected by him or her to her higher ups. So this is the failure of the professional level. The next level of the failure of the October the 7th is the failure of the political and military decision makers. What we call the conception. What was the conception? The conception was very simple: that the Hamas was beaten, it is deterred. What they are concerned is making life better for the Gazan population. They do not want war, and this was the conception, that they don't mean to go to war with us. That was the conception, and it was a very comfortable and very pleasant conception, and it made us blind to the facts that contradict it, like the 2021 Keepers of the Walls operation against Gaza, the Gaza war of 2021. So it should have functioned as a clarion call for us to wake up. We didn't wake up. Then the conception went on till it's collapsed on October the 7th. This was the second level. The third level, it's a much more general level, and we do not talk about this level generally. And I call it the failure of the elites. And it's not a Israeli specialty. The elites, when I'm talking about the failure of the elites, I'm talking about the failure of the elites of the West. We have seen the same failure in the context of the Ukraine-Russia war. We have seen elites that are so enamored by theories of Fukuyama, the end of history, and historical necessities that it just like the dialectical materialism during the communist years, that the future is predestined, and there is no chance that other societies, other civilizations will reject our way, and our domination, our hegemony reigns supreme in the world. And the Israeli elite subscribed to this false sense of security, and they lulled us into a kind of complacency at the level of the society, not only at the level of the military and the intelligence organizations, but at the level of the society. This was the third level of the failure. And the fourth level is at the level of the Israeli society. I think that we are a society that is enamored by a vision or fata morgana of normalcy, that you can live at this part of the world, which is an entirely abnormal part of the world, and you can live normal lives. We have missed the most elementary wisdom of civis pacem parabellum. Whoever wants peace has to prepare for war. And we have missed the truism that in the 50s and the 60s we subscribed to, that in order to live normal lives in this abnormal part of the world, you have to prepare and you have to organize your society, your economy, your army, your political life for an abnormal environment. You are a castle in the jungle, but the jungle is still a jungle. And we try to tell us that the jungle is not so thick anymore, and the branches of the trees are not so intertwined, and there are glimmers of light through the branches of the trees in this jungle, and perhaps this jungle is not a jungle anymore. It's more like a English park, like Kew Gardens. It's not a jungle anymore. So it's a jungle. It's a jungle, and we missed we missed this central wisdom of the previous generations, and we paid dearly for it. So these are the four levels of the failure at the level of the professional intelligence collectors and analysts, at the level of the military and political decision makers, at the general elites, to which the media, for instance, and the other influencers belong to, and the fourth level of the failure, as I described, is at the level of the Israeli society. So I would like to wind down my presentation, and what I have done, I have answered two basic questions. The first question regards why dealt with the question why this war and why now, and the second question was how this intelligence failure became possible. And I think that my conclusions are not very optimistic, but I think that as long as we draw these conclusions, we can build on them, and we can be much better prepared. And I think that it's very important that those European countries, those Western countries, those Western societies that were still unscathed by the war, prepare for it. Just be prepared. The only way to avoid it is to prepare for it. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience, and I hope that one day I will be able to make my presentation concluding this war in person. Thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful conference. Goodbye.
Our next speaker is Dr. Ori Yisachar. head of the research department of the Israeli Defense and Security Forum.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation, distinguished guests, and the distinguished Danube Institute. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for your invitation. I come here actually from Israel not only as a researcher, this very distinguished and respected conference, but also as a witness. What we've seen in Israel a month ago, on October 7, was really a collapse of a paradigm. The collapse of a paradigm that was the most painful way to watch. And I remember waking up on October 7 at 6:30 a.m. in central Israel to the sound of sirens. And it's not an extremely unusual thing to have in Israel. What we believed it was at first was yet another reaction by terrorist groups in Gaza for maybe a targeted killing. Perhaps we started yet another operation like we knew in the past very well. It wasn't maybe the rounds of conflicts every couple of months, every year or two. And then news started coming on a ground invasion. And then news never stopped coming. And we saw how the mainstream channels did not keep up with the flow of information. And I think in the end of the day, we have seen how this very thing called conception really failed. And how did this conception come to fail us? Well, I'd like to discuss this today. And what I'd like to focus on in the presentation is really the war on Middle East freedom. That would be a bit of a different prism than the quite everyday way of looking at this war, which is an Israel-Hamas conflict. And I view this in a much larger prism. I view this in a wide prism of an Israel-Iran war, of a prism of a regional war. I think it was mentioned before, the regional interests in this war, and how come Hamas chose to attack on exactly on that day. I think let's look, for example, to analogize what's going on in Israel, what used to be in Israel before October 7, to Venice, okay, of all places, a place that is constantly threatened by floods. And so very wisely, the people of Venice decided to build MOSE, a system of flood protection. And that flood protection system only works, it starts to deliver as from a flood that is 130 centimeters high. And then November 2021, a flood of 187 centimeters came. And I think maybe the analogy here comes to say that you cannot win a war on the defensive. And what Israel prepared for is yet another round. Maybe it's prepared for the previous war, but it hasn't prepared for the next war. And I think in this sense, the collapse of the paradigm really was so shattering and so devastating. So I'll start maybe by explaining why is this war any different, describe the current developments, the regional and global angle, and then disinformation as a tool of war. And maybe I'd begin by describing the horrors of October 7 very briefly, because we understand how this is a whole different ballgame now than all other previous operations. This war started by a savage murder of people who were peacefully sleeping in their homes. I remember my father telling me he used to be an artillery tank fighter in the 73. And the 1973 war actually was the last time that Israel declared a state of war. That was the first time in 50 years that Israel declared a state of war, precisely to the date. And I think this one, talking about intelligence failures and what we just heard, was much worse than a Yom Kippur war. Much worse. Because the Yom Kippur war was, quote unquote, a fair fight between two armies. And here you had civilians sleeping in their homes when Hamas terrorists invaded in. You see this woman, for example, kidnapped to Gaza with her 2 children, 2 babies. Imagine someone showing up at your door and kidnapping you to Gaza. all the atrocities that happened at the party. This is a satellite image of the October 7, what happened, and you see the smoke rising up to space. And I think one clear lesson from this massacre, at least what I feel as an Israeli, is that nobody would ever be able to take national security for granted anymore. We wouldn't be able to take silence or military supremacy, the strongest military in the region, the most stable country in the region. We would never be able to take it for granted any longer. And I think not only is this war changing a lot of things, but also images that we have never seen by far. This is, for example, now you know there is a pause in the fighting, 6 hours per day, and Hamas agreed to release a bunch of 13, 14 Israeli hostages per day, and Israel agreed to release some terrorists from Israeli jails in return. And, for example, this Israeli kid who was released from Hamas prison, and you can see how frightened he is, accompanied by these savagers accompanying him to the border. It's a whole different ballgame because, as I mentioned, Israel's objectives are now winning the war. And I think Israel has not defined the objective of winning a war for 50 years. It has defined only pushing the next conflict to a larger extent, maybe restoring deterrence, but is not defined decisively winning a war. And I think Hamas never anticipated that. It is also returning the hostages and removing the security threat from Gaza permanently. I hope we'll have the chance to speak about the day after. The realization that the containment strategy failed, I'm going to touch upon that in a second, maybe reaffirming security principles such as conscription that exists in Israel. Maybe that fences are not as efficient means of security. It's a tactic, it's a tool, but it's not a security strategy to have a fence. And then maybe the common ground that we have in this conflict, that it's I think it was mentioned before as well by Peter, that we are talking about a common threat to world peace, a common threat that both Israel and Europe face, which is extremist Islamism. And the more we realize that the Gaza attack on Israel had nothing to do with the settlements or occupation or anything else, it had everything to do with Israel's very existence. Had it been about occupation, they would have done it before 2005, when Israel left Gaza permanently. And I think what we've seen here is the manifestation of these terrorists to annihilate Israel and the Jewish people, as well as I think it has a common ground for global security. And at the end, we always see Jewish communities in Europe, in the United States, around the world at risk, because every time we enter into a war, Israel attempting to defend itself, and in the end, I think that local communities here see the ramifications, especially in Western Europe, by these protests, by these pro-Hamas calls, etc. And these are really the cost of strategy of containment that Israel never anticipated having to deal with 236 hostages taken by Hamas. And I'd like to talk about the global and regional implications of that in a second, but it maybe teaches us also a very important lesson about the Middle East. You know, for many, many years, and this is important because for many years we haven't really, I think in Israel many people did, but I don't know if that was the established opinion, that we didn't really see the enemy by putting ourselves in their shoes. We may have given them a pair of shoes, we may have put words in their mouth, but I don't think we fully accepted the fact that Hamas is not motivated by wanting money from Qatar or by caring for Gazan civilians. Hamas was motivated by the will to annihilate Israel. And it sounds like a talking point, but then it becomes reality. And one major lesson is that the Middle East is a place of a power principle. You don't win the Middle East by having discussions. This is the European way of doing things. Having agreements, a signed document, and everybody's happy. In the Middle East, you can sign a document and it's worth a piece of paper it's signed on the next day. In the Middle East, you need to be strong. And that's why I think that this war, the more Israel is victorious here, the more we increase the prospects for peace in the Middle East. Real peace, stability, and maybe involvement of Saudi Arabia, for example, in the future of Gaza. That could be a door opener for Israeli-Saudi normalization. But if you show weakness, I think in the Middle East, they smell weakness from kilometers away. And this would be a green light for everyone else to attack if Israel kind of murmurs or mumbles in Gaza, unless there is nothing short of a full victory. That's why all the calls for ceasefire come from, I think, people who speak international language and not the Middle East language. I remember John Kerry saying in 2016, John Kerry, the former US Secretary of State, he totally waved off the idea of Israeli-Arab normalization unless we resolve the Israeli-Palestinian issue first. And one of the guests here rightfully said that we tend to really dress up our solution on the Middle East rather than listen what the Middle East has to say to us. And well, what he said is that there will be no separate peace between Israel and the Arab world. I want to make that very clear with you all. I've heard several prominent politicians in Israel sometimes saying, well, the Arab world is in a very different place now. We just have to reach out to them. We can work some things with the Arab world, and then we'll deal with the Palestinians. No, 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 and no. These were 4 times no by John Kerry. 4 years later, there was the Abraham Accords, right? Israeli-Arab normalization. So I think the more people try from the outside to dress international principles on the Middle East, that would fail. And the second principle is that every compromise is temporary. Look at the Oslo Accords. Arafat agreed to compromise with Israel in order to come to the territory and continue the fight from within. And I think every time we try to understand what the Middle East has to say to us, let's put subtitles, okay? Not just from Arabic to English, maybe from English to, let's say, from the text to the subtext, okay? Because when they say, of course, we're willing to sign a contract, what they actually mean is that we are willing to have a, like the Hamas pause now, to use and leverage the advantages that the other side is giving us now in order to rearm and reorganize for the next round. There is no compromise in the Middle East. And we have to understand that. I remember, well, I confess to be a music student. I don't know if I told you, but I'm also a pianist and a composer. I graduated from the Tel Aviv Academy of Music, and I'm a concert pianist as well. And one of the things that inspired me the most were actually Bela Bartok. That's why I'm so excited to be in Hungary. And I actually play Bartok music as well. In 1931, Bartok, he was the first ethnomusician, fascinating music, and he was actually one of the pioneers to go to the Hungarian countryside. I'm sure you know all of that, and really collect samples from local peasants and their music. And he wrote in 1931, he wrote an essay saying the influence of peasant music on modern music. And out of 3 stages that a musician and a composer has to go through before composing a music of his own, a peasant music of his own, which is 1, copy the melody, right? Just take a peasant melody and put it in your piece. Second is using the idiom, having some inspiration, maybe changing the melody a little bit. But the third phase is really the inspiration, where you're so immersed in the music and the language that it becomes a second mother language for you, right? Music. So you would simply compose like local peasants used to compose. And I'm sure in Hungarian sounds better, but what I think he was trying to tell us is that you have to speak the local language and not impose your language, really to see the Middle East through the thick lens of political correctness and some international principles. Sorry? Are you sure? Okay. I would... I love the musical interlude. Yeah. All right, so I'll end up with 2 things because I prepared some slides here, but these are some of the stories we can definitely listen to. But I think let's conclude by saying this. I think in order to understand the Israeli spirit behind this war, you really need to ask yourself what's the difference between a mercenary and a soldier. A soldier that is fighting on behalf of his country and his family, or a mercenary that is paid for, like the Wagner Group, who is alternating loyalties every few hours, or a functionary that just does bureaucratic work. But I think a soldier really understands what they're fighting for. Ben-Gurion said, everything we did in the pioneership of the Jewish revival, the fences, the guns, the planes, it will only stand if our spirit stands. And I think we will stand on our sword forever. I don't think we have any other choice by having a strong military and military supremacy and a ready army. But I think also the spirit behind it tells us the whole story. That people know they fight best when they know what they're fighting for. Major General Gershon Cohen has a book called What's National about national security. What makes national security national and not technical? And I think the national aspect of it is really what you're seeing here. Soldiers who are, for example, on the left-hand side, are doing what the Golani Brigade did, which is having a military ceremony with the flags of Israel in the Hamas base in Gaza, where the attack came from. And one of these, for example, one of the people who were taken hostage, Eliakim Livman, his two brothers are fighting in Gaza right now and coming to rescue him. And every place they go, they graffiti on the wall, Eliakim, we got until here, please wait a little longer, we'll get to you too. And these soldiers know exactly what they're fighting for. And that's why I mean by the spirit. With all the, and I will finish there, which really, a lot of people really compare Hamas to Nazis, to the Nazi regime. And I think Hitler, when invading the USSR, he said, we'll slam the door open and the whole structure will come crumbling down. And that's what Hamas was hoping to do, and they will end up, hopefully, much like they did by doing these things. And I think I'll get to the last slide very quickly, and we'll talk about all the rest later on. One day, that at the end of the day, if you understand what you're fighting for, you'll fight much better. I think there was a strategic crossroads in Israeli history. And what we know now is that the bigger the victory will be, the more likely the prospects for peace in the Middle East will be. Thank you so much.
That was very good. I wish we did have more time for it because it was really fascinating. Next speaker is Dr. Tomasz Peter Berani, Strategic Director, Institute, Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Yeah, it was quite good. Thank you very much. So, is this how I... Okay, so good afternoon. Thank you very much. It's a humble experience to be here at the stage with distinguished experts on the Middle East, ranging from Zionism to modern Islam political thought. So I would just first concentrate on what do I have to say in this story, and for this my title is important. I'm Director for Strategy in the Hungarian Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade. That is a position where sometimes me and my team really has to say something about what's going on and what to do for decision makers. So for this reason, I think it's important to recapitulate Israeli-Hungarian relations. Why do you matter a lot? And how was the news of the October the 7th attack was received? What were the emerging questions? And what were the previous policy recommendations? So it is basically to open a window of, to a certain extent, to our work, and what is the thing, what are the things that we discussed, that we were thinking of, and what were our conclusions. And I'm also here to engage you, let my views engaged by you, and to learn, because again, part of my job is that I really have to be, well informed in these questions. I also have to tell you that I'm very slow in understanding how things like this actually work. Just the green one. Yeah. Okay, so this one. Oh, that's also a button. Great. Okay, so, and I also try to be succinct because we are lagging behind. So we can name very important points for which Israel is important for Hungary. And, they are geographically apart and not part of the same region. Could be like a much less important relation, but it is because there are a lot of shared points in foreign political and overall political approaches between the two countries, like this very committed Hungarian position on foreign trade and European security approach. It is pretty much shared by Israel, also by its emphasis on sovereignty, security, but also if you go a bit deeper into more policy details like family policy and this whole commitment to nation is also a shared point. Very shortly again, Israel is also a country where you have relatives from Hungary. This is a strange experience from Hungary because you don't really have, sizable diaspora, especially beyond the Carpathian Mountains. We don't really have, but Israel is of course a place when you sit in a taxi and you have to watch your mouth because your taxi driver might know Hungarian. And this is something Hungarians never face in any corner of the world, but in Israel you can. So we have this, let's say family relationship also. So that's why it's also important what's happening in Israel. But Israel is also, part of the Hungarian network of conservative governments, and also Hungary invested a lot into the idea of the Abraham Accords, the logic of which is, of course, the prioritizing prosperity for all sides before tackling with seemingly unresolvable political issues. And the Hungarian government lent sympathy to this approach from day one, and also considered that it is a useful and viable option for many different conflict-ridden places on the globe. So what if we just stop fighting and thinking about, again, unresolvable political causes, instead try to concentrate on everyone's prosperity. And also, of course, when news broke about the surprise attack of October the 7th, most of the Hungarian population instantly, a huge sympathy for Israel was inspired. So this is how it's a special relationship for the present government of Hungary and also of Hungary. And now I just recapitulate with just a few keywords how we do see the Middle East at the Institute for Foreign Affairs and Trade. So in recent years, tremendous transformative occurrences happening in the Middle East. The net result of which was that the salience of Islamist radicalism has indeed declined, and also the unifying nature of the Palestinian cause also declined. It was due to a number of different reasons, but I think it's pretty much the consensus that it did. And it was also strengthened by the parallel tendency of some sort of a great power withdrawal. I wouldn't say maybe withdrawal, maybe retrenchment in the Middle East, a recalibration of priorities. And what happened in the region, on the regional level, was the emergence of the thing that some scholars say competitive heteropolarity. That basically means that in the absence of major great power inspiration, more states developed their own distinctive foreign policies in a more active manner than it was like 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So two countries, for instance, just to name one example, like the Emirates and Saudi Arabia are undertaking war in Yemen, and with their own specific goals. And those specific goals, even though the two countries are aligned, those two specific sets of goals may not be the same, because that's the situation. That is what some of the scholars title as competitive heteroplurality, which is a complicated word, but actually it is pretty apt to describe the situation. Previously, earlier, again, support for the Palestinian cause was very strong among Arab countries, and for quite some time it served as a substitute for a common Arab polity. That was something that was a common denominator. Some of the Arab states, we really have to sit by the same table because we all support the Palestinian cause. This has declined, again, to a set of different reasons. So did political Islamism, not least because of the rise and fall of Daesh, the Islamic State, which did a lot, even on a regional level, to discredit Islamic radicalism. This has actually created the ground of the Abraham Accords, which was deemed, absolutely non-viable just a few years ago, few years before they were actually concluded, because no one foresaw that focusing on prosperity would eventually indeed reach some sort of an agreement on coexistence, only with a focus on economic matters. But that was, of course, a problem, because Arab and Middle East states were inclined to normalize the relationship with Israel, but not necessarily the respective populations. And there is a tendency, and there is, I would say, a tradition in Middle Eastern countries to disregard the will of the people, to disregard, the public sentiment, but it is only possible to a certain extent. And Arab countries' enmity, hostility towards Israel, even though it has its, tides and depths, it is pretty much a factor. And in recent years, this sentiment could have been, bracketed, could have been, put in the back front by the state's interests of normalization with Israel. And this is perhaps one of the most important effects of Hamas's attack on Israel, that this sentiment has now come to the forefront. Also, at this point, we have to also refer to the fact that some of the countries on a state level were anti-Abraham Accords countries, like Iran, of course, but also Turkey, who were more against the Abraham Accords, and who did a lot to maintain their role as a defender of the Palestinian cause. So I think this is the backdrop against which the October 7th surprise attack should be analyzed. And this is actually how we did it at the Hungarian Institute for International Affairs. So our first idea, which is, again, it emerged as a consensus that one of the immediate trigger for this attack was the prospect of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. And I have to tell something very sad. I think at this point, Hamas was extremely successful. I think the rapidity with which the Abraham Accords became questioned, and the two-state solution, the primacy of the two-state solution, and the Palestinian cause again came to the forefront was indeed surprising. And I'm not here to tell you that the two-state solution is bad, only that even if it's good, I think, pretty objectively, the background is not ready to do that. For instance, there is, the Palestinian Authority is not one state, maybe two. So it's pretty hard to have a two-state solution if you have three state-like entities. However, on an international stage, the two-state solution is now, again, pretty much on the forefront, which has not been the case before. So it really struck a major blow to Israel's image, because Israel had this know-it-all image before. Like the Israelis, okay, they commit mistakes, but they are always very much aware of the strategic situation, and they basically make good decisions. In Hungarian governmental circles, for instance, this rule of 9, which may be an urban legend, but I don't think so, that in Israeli decision-making, if too many people agrees on the same thing, then instantly a red team is formed to see where the idea is broken. Apparently there wasn't such a red team with regards to the role of Hamas before the surprise attack. But again, this is how, this may be an urban legend, but this is how the Israeli proficiency is very much esteemed in the Hungarian government. As usually, because the attack again was a success, maybe not on the level that it really did manage to kill and frighten people on such a scale that would threaten Israel's existence. No. But to the extent that Hamas signaled that they are there, they are able to put back the Palestinian issue, the two-state solution on the agenda, it was pretty much a success, and it really did inspire Islamic radicalism in the region and also beyond. And this is pretty much actually how it works. For quite some months, years now, I think it was also part of the consensus that political Islamism was on the wane. It was something withered away. This is a, even though I'm not a Middle East expert, this was a point with which I often took issue with. I think this phenomenon is more like it comes in waves, and now I think sadly enough we will very likely to witness yet another wave to come, simply because it proved to be politically successful, but also we have to see the end of this war to judge this. I think two very important issues emerged on day one. One of them was the possibility of escalation. And connected to this very tightly was the level and the internationality of planning. Whether Iran or some of the proxies of Iran, especially Hezbollah, took part in planning this attack or not. And again, without proper intelligence, because how would we get that? We really had to say something about this, and we actually concluded that it is very likely that it was not a coordinated attack, and everyone pretty much seemed surprised. That doesn't mean that other actors were not up to anything good. It is only that the level of synchronicity and planning was not high enough. Connected to this was the issue of escalation, because, of course, Israel is surrounded by hostile powers and entities, and attacks already began on day one, especially from southern Lebanon, like the Hezbollah. The question was whether it is an antechamber of a major regional war, of a major escalation, or this is something that is like pretty much a natural reaction from those hostile powers whose very political culture is based on anti-colonialism, which is understood as Israel, anti-Zionism. And there were like signs. One of the signs was that Hezbollah immediately launched rockets launched missiles onto the territory of Israel, let's say. But again, I think it was telling that at this point, Hezbollah targeted the Sheba Farms territories, which they consider their own territory. So in this very wicked rules of engagement, they didn't quite attack the territory of Israel. That doesn't mean that it is not a hostile act. It only shows that they were aware of not to shoot beyond this line, which meant that they were afraid of escalation. So you had those hints that at this point, they are not very much interested in escalation. And this is a conclusion we actually hold today. And our approach or our idea here is that the status quo, so they really saw Israel pulling together her strength, and society proved to be very much resilient, and the Israeli national sentiment rose up to the sky, I would say, and in also that the United States is behind Israel, even though it's more reluctantly than before, and more strings attached, but still the Americans are behind the Israelis, and the warships were commanded to go there, and this is a combination which signals that Israel is not the threatened and surprised victim that she seemed to be on the very first morning. And in this scenario, in this setting, I think none of those players are very much interested in any escalation, or an escalation that is decided by them to get a higher gear, because their own position are also vulnerable, like especially Hezbollah's in southern Lebanon, which is anything but very stable and prosperous, and also because their political goals could only be slightly supported by a very costly and very dangerous war. Maybe if we call this status quo, and then we can say, if the status quo is threatened, like with the complete elimination of Hamas, that would definitely alter the situation and would definitely alter the regional equation, then their calculation might be different. But at the present moment, they seem not be interested in escalation. And the second very obvious takeaway was how important is the information warfare theater, especially with some of the casualties of the bombardment of Gaza, with the strike that hit the hospital, and the anti-Israeli press, the anti-Israeli international network became so loud that it really threatened with the alteration of the international arena for this war. I think at the beginning, Israel was very much losing in this international information warfare. But since then, the whole picture is more balanced. And I don't know how much time I'm having. Like 2 minutes? I'm at the end of it. So, just in a nutshell, to recapitulate some of the key questions again, and our key understandings. And again, I'm here to just present you with this, and then I'm mostly ready for your engagement and your ideas about this, because I have to be aware of all of it. Again, this conflict is able to tip the balance of powers in the Middle East, but again, only if the elimination of Hamas is at hand eventually. If not, then I don't think escalation is very likely, though you can never know in the Middle East. Also, the importance of international warfare was highlighted again, and how decent Western political cultures are just unready for communication warfare has also been stressed by this conflict. The role of the mediator countries, I think, were also stressed, like those of Turkey and Qatar. And I think the role of Turkey is very interesting in itself, because Turkey presented herself again as a player in the Middle East, of which this country was basically excluded for any major political move apart from northern Syria, northern Iraq. That's a change. And the elevation of Qatar as a mediator is also something, I wouldn't say new, but again, it was stressed. And even though Qatar's ties to Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhoods are also always very questionable, it proved that we all need their connections, for instance, for a hostage deal with Israel. Hungary's approach for this moment, and this is my last thought and last sentence, is, I really try to be quick, is a vindication. So I think the Hungarian government has this idea that we did say that security comes first. We did say that even though you have to be able to maintain good relations with everyone, there are certain limits that you really have to obey. And for us, for the Hungarian government, the good relationship and support for Israel is one such thing. Thank you very much. It wasn't very bad. Thank you.
It was very good. Thank you. Next, Dr. Attila Novak, historian from Ludovika University of Public Service.
Thank you very much. I will give the 10 minutes. Okay. It's very difficult to speak out on a region whose location, also far away from Hungary, is important not only for the global world and mankind, but also for me personally. Just hours before the outbreak of the recent war, I returned with my son from Israel, where I was first with the Sochnut group in 1989, Kibbutz Ulpan, where I was a student at the Hebrew University in the 1990s, and where I spent years as a cultural diplomat at the Hungarian embassy in the 2010s. My son went to kindergarten and school in an Israeli kibbutz Netanya when we lived in Tel Aviv. So we are personally affected. My son's former classmates, like other Israelis, are fleeing to shelters to escape the rocket attacks of Hamas, and many of their families are fighting in the Israeli army. Let me tell you about my thoughts and share with you, subjective, of course, opinion. This is not a tactical point of view or an analysis on the current war, but a personal reflection on the whole conflict. I may be wrong, but since I don't live in the day-to-day conflict, I can make a more general view from such a distance. Israel's war in Gaza is justified, or if you like, legitimate. Israeli forensic institutes are still stacking up the blown-up body parts of partying young people of the Nova Festival and other places based on their DNA of the surrounding Israeli territory next to the Gaza Strip called Otef-Aza, so that the funerals can take place in order fashion. It is in vain for the world to show photos of bombed Gaza buildings and fleeing Palestinians in people's faces, in vain for it to point to the otherwise real Palestinian human suffering that Israel's military response is directly inflicting on the local Arab population. Although the suffering is real, the real culprits are the Islamist leaders of Gaza who have imposed themselves on the civilian population. Israel, even its dwindling left-wing Tutsi supporters, are unmoved by these images of Gaza. The sight of murdered, burned, dismembered, blown-up fellow citizens, including many kids, occupies the consciousness of the Israeli society. The fact that there are many Israeli hostages in the underground labyrinth in Gaza has not deterred the military and political leaders from the military invasion. Release of Israeli prisoners is very important for the state, but it slows down the military action somewhat and reduces its effectiveness. However, this is perfectly understandable. Israel is a country that will stand by its citizens in such a situation and do everything it can for their lives and freedom. But the higher goal remains to destroy at all costs the Hamas regime that carried out the 7th October attack. Israel doesn't want immediate peace, but longer-term security, which is now wants to achieve by military means. In the world, Arab-Israeli clashes and wars are accompanied by a media war, the spectacle of more blood, the sacrifice here again on the Palestinian side, the concomitant rising global anti-Semitism, the growing hatred to Israel and Jews has captivated many Muslim groups and left-wing academia around the world. The Palestinian cause is mobilizing the Arab world, and for the Islamic communities in the West, it is an excuse for the problems. The Palestinian cause is also a way of demonstrating against the West. Christians, as a minority, enjoy in Israel, by regional comparison, a unique freedom, if we are talking about one of the tastes of this conference. The real reasons for these situations are clear, but it should not be denied that there is also some truth in the criticism that the situation that was and what we might call the status quo does not seem to be appropriate. There is a reason for all this, perhaps partly understandable, but what has emerged in the control of one people of another. The collapse of the Oslo process, the Palestinian terror, is of course responsible for the situation that has arisen, but the presence of hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers in the West Bank is not only a consequence on this. In 1967, a process was set in motion, the Messianic Israel right marching on its glorious demographic and political path. The massacre by Hamas is horrific and requires a military response, but that does not mean that the whole Palestinian cause can be identified with the Hamas. The reasons are, of course, largely known, and I am not even sure that this is not a matter of law. I am also not sure whether, if there were greater freedom, this would be put to good use, and whether it would not lead to a creation of another violent Islamist outpost in the region. However, the actual consequences of the situation that has developed are regrettable, and the region is being constantly dehumanized and kept in a state of violence. The Gaza problem itself is partly the result of Israel thinking that it could be managed in the usual way. The Israeli political elite believed that the smart border, finalized in 2021, has solved the Gaza problem and the Palestinian problem of Gaza. The problems are over there, the cage is strong and secure, and the other side of the border in the world of normal people. In Israel, it's safe to party and live. A complex program is managed, if not solved, by technology that isolates, reacts, and protects. Life has shown us through the death of hundreds of innocent people where this kind of attitude leads. The status quo has been broken, this old view of security has been damaged. Israel will think about some kind of regional political security beyond the security fence, the bulletproof vest, and the machine gun. Regional political security, which is not the same as the reconciliation with the rest of the Arab world. It is clear that after all these years, it's not easy to reach an agreement with the Palestinian side. The failure of the Oslo process, the intentions of the Palestinian leadership, the Iranian involvement are all present, which did not make things easy. Islamic radicalism, Palestinian no-thinkism, terrorism must of course be rejected, but let us not equate all Palestinian problems with death. I think that just as they were wrong in the 1990s that there was a peace partner and that peace was achievable, they are wrong now that the status quo is eternal and the Palestinian issue is no longer an issue. We need not, and perhaps should not look for, but any settlement, not management, should not only start from the premise that Israel, its citizens, should be safe, also the basic task of the state is to ensure this, but should also understand that security cannot and should not be achieved by armed force alone. Islamic terror and Palestinian radicalism must also be combated in such a way that, for example, Gazans caught in their own dark political vortex can, in time, feel a little better than they have done so far. If the devastation in Gaza is followed by reconstruction, the new rulers of the territory, and paradoxically it will not be Israel, I think, must strive to improve the life prospects of people indoctrinated from childhood in the spirit of the Hamas ideology. Increased interaction, greater freedom and prosperity can bring the region closer to the new Middle East that Shimon Peres once envisioned. It will not bring peace, but it makes our world a better place than it has been. Reality is not pretty, but we can always dream, especially in such bad times. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you. And our final in-person speaker for this panel is Dr. László Churchman, the professor from Corvinus University of Budapest.
Dear distinguished audience, thanks for the invitation, and let me express my gratitude to the Danube Institute for having me invited and organizing this very timely event. So I would continue where my colleagues stopped, and my question is very complex. However, it's quite simple. Who rules the Middle East, and what the regional order looks like? And what has changed since the 7th of October, which I cannot predict, of course, but I'm trying to say a few words about regional order and the Middle East. I'm an expert of Middle East studies, having visited majority of countries, been to Iran and Israel as well. Just a quick remarks about the previous order in the Middle East. And since the 2010s, which is the post-Arab Spring, I would argue that there is an absence of a regional order. So the Middle Eastern characteristics is rather a regional disorder due to three issues. The first, there is the global competition in the Middle East. So it's not anymore an American-dominated Middle East, but how it has been called, it is a post-American Middle East, where at least 5 countries compete with each other, which is the United States, China, EU, Russia, and India lately as well. And I would say that no one can dominate, and there is no willingness neither from China to dominate the region. That's very important remark, and what we see during this regional disorder situation, that we have at least 2 or 3 alliances or camps in the region. One definitely is the Axis of Resistance camp led by Iran. The other is Saudi Arabia, the so-called moderate Arab countries. And there is even a third one, the Turkish-Qatari cooperation, which resulted in weak states and proxy wars in the region. So the region is very much in a regional supremacy trap, because we have Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel as the most important regional countries, which can be divided at least into 2 major groups. We have the status quo countries, Saudi Arabia and Israel, and the revisionist countries, Iran and Turkey. Of course, it's not I'm saying about their cooperation, it's just I'm saying about their intention to change the status quo in the region. And very recently, it's a very unprecedented what we have been witnessing since 2020 is the so-called normalization and de-escalation, especially after the devastating year of 2019 and early 2010, when a regional escalation of the situation, especially in the between the United States and Iran, it was not far from reality. And then, very unprecedentedly, on many levels in the region, we have been witnessing a wave of very positive sign, the Abraham Accords, which means that Israel is a legitimate actor in the region, recognized by many Arab states, and this whole story was decoupled. This is the term from the technological competition, that this normalization decoupled from the Palestinian issue. On the other side, we see, it is very interesting to observe, but we see an ease of the sectarian conflicts between Shias and Sunnis. Just think about the recent cooperation or restoration of diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia this March, and Turkey-Israeli relations, Turkey-Saudi Arabia rapprochements, which I would argue it was mainly based on a perception of a global uncertainty in the region by the regional actors themselves. And just let me quote the year 2021, when the United States left Kabul, and it sent a very negative message to those countries that our main protector, the United States, left the country. So this loneliness feeling forced these countries to cooperate in a shifting world order situation, which on the other side, the United States built an exit strategy, a gradual disengagement strategy on that, which is called by the Trump administration as the Middle East security architecture, with marginalizing Iran, with building relations between India, Israel, United Arab Emirates, the United States as well. Just think about the very recent announcement in September this year, just before the conflict, of the India-Middle East Economic Corridor Plan. I would argue, even during this normalization phase, the United States remains the main security provider. China is not able to replace the United States in this manner, and it remains an economic actor with more political ambitions. And it was called before the 7th of October, we see a kind of emerging new regional order, which very recently challenged by the sad events of the 7th of October. What we see today is a very divided Middle East again, which is not a surprise, I would say, since the 7th of October. And definitely we should divide the rhetoric of Arab countries or Middle Eastern countries and the foreign policy behavior, so the concrete acts. In my opinion, what we see here, the most important region in the Middle East is, of course, the Gulf region, because they set the political agenda. And at least we see three camps among the GCC countries with a very different response to the conflict. We have the countries with no ties at all, which is Kuwait. We have the pragmatic coexistence group, which is Qatar, for instance, which previously not openly never admitted that it has relations with Israel. And now we know that Qatar is a very important player in this game. Oman as well, or Saudi Arabia here as well. And we have the countries with full normalization, like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Although we saw a very harsh rhetoric by most of the Arab states, however, I'm cautiously optimistic with continuing with this Abraham Accords, especially just think what happened. Very recently, there were some summits from where we can measure Arab states' position on this crisis. First, it was mentioned that Hamas is of course a group which was marginalized, and of course the majority of Arab states not like to see any Hamas rule in the region. Just think about Egypt, what happened there in 2013, or just think about Saudi Arabia itself. The major countries here, which are important, of course, Saudi Arabia, which on the 11th of November in Riyadh, they organized a joint conference of Arab and Muslim states, even where the Iranian president visited. And what we see here is a failure of a joint resolution. So there was no even political outcome of this meeting, because there were some states blocking the resolution because it was too harsh reactions against Israel. For instance, some of the Arab states even have been thinking to cut all relations, all shipments, and many other things to Israel. But however, there were some boycotting Israel on a more global level. But however, there were some countries vetoed this resolution, and it was Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Morocco, who are partners in the so-called Abraham Accords. And I think this is a very important sign, despite the fact that Bahrain after the attack on the Gaza Strip, announced the cease of the economic relations between Bahrain and Israel by the lower house of the parliament. But however, I would argue it's mainly a short-term situation. And Egypt, there was a larger peace conference previously organized by the president, inviting European countries as well, and there was a failure of uniting even the Arab countries in the same position. But of course, on the other side, there is Iran, which we know that there are some groups in the Middle East who are interested in escalation. But however, I would argue that Iran is not much interested in a direct confrontation with Israel. Just think about the consequences on the Iranian regime. Survival would be questions of the Iranian regime because of Israel's military supremacy, I would argue. And just think about that. Iran is not much interested in to see American troops return to the Middle East. But going on is the US support to Israel, the two warships. It's a sign that Americans not exist from the Middle East, which is bad from the Iranian point of view, I would argue. Yeah, Qatar has been playing a mediator role, and theoretically speaking, it's quite interesting to see that it was Qatar which mediated between the Taliban and the United States several years ago, because there was a belief in the United States there is a pragmatic group among the Talibans which can bring a Taliban 2.2 back to Kabul, which was, we know that it's a complete failure because it's quite similar from an ideological point of view. And theoretically speaking, it's quite interesting to think about the difference between the political wing of Hamas and the military wing, because we used to believe here in the West that Hamas is a homogeneous group, which is not. It is a network of different wings, and we know which is, the whole group is radical, of course, but this political wing, I would say it's much more pragmatic, at least in its thinking about Israel. And there are some scholars who argue that maybe the political wing can take over the military wing, which I don't believe that Israel will allow it at this moment, because it's part of the same story and the whole Taliban issue fade a lot. Turkey is not a major player now in this game. And of course, one of the main questions is the political roadmap. And here, I would argue one of the consequences and the price of this conflict is that the Palestinian issue is back on the table, which means that neither Arab countries who fully normalize with Israel, nor Israel can take the Palestinian issue aside after 7th of October. And I think it's the main question. Who will rule the Gaza Strip, of course? We have a lot of theoretical assumptions. One is, of course, potentialist reunification of the Palestinian Authority, but the problem is the lack of legitimacy of Fatah and Mahmoud Abbas. And Hamas is not much rooted in the West Bank, not has much legitimacy, like the Fatah has not much legitimacy in the Gaza Strip. And this is a huge problem. And this is, of course, not only Israel responsible for that, but Palestinians and, of course, the Arab states are responsible for that, to organize a new type of Palestinian leadership, or ruled by Israel politically. I don't believe in that either. Or a kind of international rule, but with Israel providing security, maybe the third option is the scenario. But however, I would believe that this is the main question, of course, is not the military supremacy of Israel. One of the theoretical issues, whether we see here the collapse of the American exit strategy, I think it's quite clear now that the United States is the only global player which can mediate at this moment. It's not China. China was, there was very recently, a few days ago, a visit by some of the Arab and Muslim countries' leaders and the Palestinian leader to gain support for the Palestinian issue. But however, I would believe that China is not a major player at this very moment, but it is the United States. And this questions the whole US foreign policy strategy, which is the so-called exit strategy, that we should return to the Middle East. And from the same security perspective as the US conducted its foreign policy before. And especially quite recently, I saw that the United States moved away from this strategy, focusing more on interconnectivity projects like the IMEC, India Middle East Economic Corridor, connecting regions, building alliances, and not the traditional security perception. And with this 7th October incident, we see a return of this security strategy. So I would say that because of economic necessities, because of global uncertainty, I'm cautiously optimistic about the continuation of talks between Saudi Arabia and Israel, not in the short term, but definitely it's Saudi Arabia's interest to cooperate with Israel and to have a civilian program, nuclear program, which is the major outcome from the Saudi perspective. And economic necessities are there, and there is I would say, common enemy for them. Is radical Islam definitely is a common enemy for all countries involving in this normalization process. Saudis are not happy to see Hamas in power in Gaza. It's quite critical with the movement. Qatar is very different, and it was the main cause of the Saudi-Qatari diplomatic rift between 2017 and 2021, that the Qataris, along with the Turkish friends, supported those movements everywhere in the region, from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, 2012, or in other countries. Those groups, those Islamic groups at the very moment could not address the necessities of the people. So I'm cautiously optimistic about continuing the Abraham Accords, but definitely with a different content and perception, and not without sidelining the whole regional phenomenon, the whole Palestinian situation, which means that not only Israel is responsible for this. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, our final presentation for the panel section of the conference is from Dr. Matthew Levitt from the Washington Institute of Near East Policy, who will be addressing us in video. One note I want to make is that in, I believe, one of the first panels, there was the claim that the Hamas had roughly 60 to 70% support in Gaza of the citizenry. What Dr. Levitt conducted an independent poll and found the diametric opposite, that roughly 60% opposed Hamas. So again, if there's an overriding lesson of this conference, it's this. There's always something deeper, and you can't always believe what you see on either side. It's a very complex situation, and one that will be very, very difficult to unravel. So let's go with Dr. Levitt's video, and then Professor Dejou will give his presentation. It'll be about 7 minutes late, but that's not too bad for a conference of this size. Please, with the video.
Hi, I'm Dr. Matthew Levitt from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I direct the Counterterrorism and Intelligence program here and teach at Georgetown University. And I'm really thrilled to be able to participate in this Danube Institute conference. I'm grateful to Dr. Jeffrey Kaplan for inviting me. I'm just sad that I couldn't join you in person. But the events that we're talking about today have kind of overtaken my life and the life of many others. And so I'm thrilled that we were at least able to do this recording and share my thoughts with you this way. I'll share with you right off the top my email address. If anybody wants to follow up, I'd be very happy to do that. It's mlevitt, mlevitt at Washington Institute, one big long word, .org, mlevitt at washingtoninstitute.org. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists stormed from Gaza into Israel, savagely butchered some 1,200 Israelis. The number has been estimated down since some of the people who were thought to have been killed have in fact been taken hostage. And some of the people who were killed, who were thought to be civilians, have turned out to be some of the Hamas attackers. And about 240 civilians and Israeli soldiers, but mostly civilians, of almost 30 countries taken captive, on top of the several thousand wounded. I can't stress enough how much this attack has changed everything for the Israelis. It is not an exaggeration to say that this is more for Israel than 9/11 was for the United States. I'm not just talking in terms of the sheer numbers, which if extrapolated proportionately to the size of the country is a much, much bigger attack for small Israel than 9/11 was in the United States. I worked 9/11 when I was at the FBI. I led the analytical team for Flight 175. I'm very, very familiar with those days and how stressful and scary they were, but the United States was under no type of existential threat. And most Americans just saw this on CNN, and that was their closest relationship to those attacks. Whereas in Israel, everybody knows somebody who has been directly affected by October 7th, and everybody more knows somebody or has someone close to them who has now been called up to the military to defend the country from Hamas and try and secure the release of the hostages, and to try and dislodge Hamas from its governance project, its safe haven in the Gaza Strip. It's a very, very different ball of wax. Even when the United States went to war in Afghanistan, that was very, very far away. For the Israelis, the war in Gaza is literally right next door, and the consequence of a failure to succeed, to reestablish deterrence, to reestablish a sense of security amongst Israelis around the whole country, but in particular among those who lived in the South. Without that, they won't go back home, no matter how nicely those communities are rebuilt. This is a real challenge. But there's a second challenge that Israel is facing at the same time, and that is from the north, from Lebanese Hezbollah. And that's what I've been asked to talk about today. Now, first, I think it's important to note the connection between the two goes back to the beginning of the story of the planning for this operation. There's been lots of speculation about what role exactly did Iran play in the October 7th massacre. Did Iran know in advance? I think that misses the point. Iran has been a sponsor of Hamas, funding it, arming it, training it, providing intelligence since the beginning, since Hamas was founded in December 1987. And that has continued throughout, even when Hamas left Damascus, where for a long time they had their external headquarters, because Hamas broke with the Assad regime, which was butchering Sunni Muslims. And Hamas, while partnered with Shia Iran, and Shia Hezbollah is itself a Sunni Muslim organization, even then, there was a split of sorts with Iran, and Iran curtailed some of its funding from Hamas, but that was mostly for the political side. The funding for the militant activities continued apace even during that period of discomfort and their disagreement over the Assad regime in Syria. In time, that rift, that split, that disagreement between Hamas and Iran was bridged. And certainly over the past few years, they've been working very closely together. So at the end of the day, Iran, certainly in terms of, say, U.S. legal principles, is culpable and does bear significant responsibility. You can't take a wind-up toy and wind it up and point it in a direction and then be surprised when it goes in that direction. This is the Hamas that Iran helped create. But the role of Hezbollah, to me, is much, much clearer. Not in terms of sending operatives to the Gaza Strip or participating in it in any tangible way. Hamas didn't need that. What stood out for me, as soon as I could stand back a day or two after the October 7th attack and take a look at it, was that this Hamas attack is exactly out of the Hezbollah playbook. I have been going to the northern border of Israel and touring that border, the Lebanese border, the Golan border with Syria, all the way down to the triple border between Israel, Jordan, and Syria for 12, 15 years. And over that time, especially just the past 3, 4, 5 years, I've gotten briefings from the Israelis time and time again that the number one threat they were literally training to thwart, because their intelligence indicated that this was something Hezbollah was preparing for, not necessarily tomorrow, but at some point, was exactly this plot. A plot where Hezbollah operatives would storm across the border, the blue line, above ground, below ground. Remember a few years ago, the Israelis found and sealed Hezbollah tunnels. I've been in some of those Hezbollah tunnels. I've also been in several of the Hamas tunnels. They would come above ground also. They would come via the maritime border, storm Israeli communities, which on the northern border are literally right on the border, not a quarter mile, a mile in, as they are in the south in what they call the Gaza envelope. Kill as many people as possible, take as many people hostage back into Lebanon as possible, set traps and IEDs and explosive foreign projectiles to attack the first responders, and then kind of dare Israel to come and fight Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Part of the surprise of October 7th isn't just the surprise that Hamas did this, which none of us expected, me too, mea culpa. It's not just that the Israeli security, intelligence, high-tech fence, surveillance, that entire set of systems failed. It's also that it was Hamas that carried out this plot in the south and not Hezbollah in the north, which was what the Israelis had been fearing and expecting. But there's now, 30-something days into this conflict, an entirely different aspect to the Hezbollah plot. And that is that Hamas is the runt of the Iran threat network litter. It is the least capable of Iran's proxies. And little Hamas did this in Gaza. Imagine what Hezbollah can do from the north. Hezbollah has somewhere between 150,000 to 200,000 rockets of different types. Most of these are short range. Others are longer range, but are not smart rockets. You aim them generally at a city or a community and you hope for the best. But at least several hundred are very advanced, smart rockets with large payloads that can go basically the length of Israel and are not fired at a community or a neighborhood or a block or a building, but a window, and can do tremendous damage. If Hezbollah decides to enter this war in a serious way, the Israelis are prepared and have made it very clear to Hezbollah, as have U.S. and other European interlocutors, that the Israeli intention is to hit back and hit back very, very hard. And there is an element of deterrence that remains today. But the damage that Hezbollah could do would be severe. At a minimum, Hezbollah wants to draw Israeli forces to the north so that Israel doesn't have as many forces available to prosecute its war against Hamas in Gaza. They want to be seen as participating in this, great attack, as they see it, targeting the Jewish state, whether or not it is the war to end all wars and from their perspective destroy Israel, which I guarantee you it is not, for many reasons, not the least of which is 2 U.S. aircraft carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean are there to make sure people understand we, the United States, won't tolerate that if it should come to it. But Hezbollah wants to be a part of this. The Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, has been saying for years that Israel is weaker than a spider's web. Imagine, this is a theologically based group. They believe that they are doing God's work, and that when the supreme leader of Iran says something, he is saying it's God's mouthpiece on earth. And when things then begin to happen that seem to vindicate Nasrallah's position, sharp intercommunal tensions within Israel, really deep political divisions within Israel, some of the elite military reserve units saying, we don't intend to show up for our regular training sessions under the Netanyahu government if the Netanyahu government goes ahead with these judicial reforms. For them, this was vindicating Hezbollah's prediction, his prophecy, if you will. I think when all the dust settles, and that is going to take some time, it is going to become clear that this plot will date back probably 2 years to 2021. And I think we're going to see that Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran all looked at the last Hamas-Israel rocket war in 2021, which was about a 13-day war or so, and said, you know what? This is not working. We fire rockets at Israel. We don't get anywhere close to the idea of destroying Israel. We don't get anybody to join us in this fight. We don't develop tensions within Israeli society where 1/5 of the population is Arab, mostly Muslim. And we get the stuffing kicked out of us in return. We're stuck in Gaza. We're stuck with a governance project, which is not the main point of our existence. And so you have probably heard Hamas officials speaking very publicly since then, saying, look, providing for the citizens of Gaza, that's not our main job. Building bomb shelters for the citizens as opposed to tunnels for the operatives, that's not our job. Leave that to the United Nations. Our job is to seek the destruction of Israel. And I think it's important here, if you'll allow me a short, quick interlude, to highlight, being against Hamas is not the same as being against the Palestinians. Hamas is not the Palestinians. Here at the Washington Institute, my colleagues conducted a poll in the summer. We published the results, which you can find on our website just a few weeks ago. And they were very, very clear. Upwards of 70% of the population of Gaza did not like Hamas, wanted Hamas out of Gaza and no longer governing them, did not support Hamas targeting Israel, and wanted Hamas disarmed. Hamas is not fighting because of occupation. It's not fighting because of a lack of a two-state solution. Hamas is dead set against a two-state solution. It is against a secular Palestinian state. Hamas wants and only wants an Islamist state in all of what it considers historic Palestine, all of the West Bank, all of the Gaza Strip, and all of what is now the state of Israel. And I think, therefore, we understand how in the years since that last war in 2021, Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran quite publicly talked about how they were meeting together in Beirut, Lebanon, in what they called, their term, not mine, a joint operations room, where this kind of idea started percolating. It seems very clear to me this is when Hezbollah starts sharing its operational plan for what it was looking to do in the north, and Hamas develops it for the south. When was this going to actually be carried out? I don't think Hamas knew right away. But I think that there was a precipitant event that led them, and Hezbollah and Iran for that matter, to decide now is the time. And that precipitant event was the prospect of Israeli-Saudi normalization. I think Iran and its proxies, chief among them Hezbollah and Hamas, looked at the Abraham Accords and were particularly concerned at how quickly these developed between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and in particular, insofar as they relate to air defense and cyber defense cooperation. Iran sees this and recognizes that some of its most potent offensive weapons that it can deploy against the Gulf states were being countered by Israeli technology and Israeli cooperation. The prospect of getting Israel and more Gulf states involved in this and creating a seriously capable regional air defense system and a regional cyber defense system is something that makes Iran concerned, because suddenly its ability to project power is minimized, is mitigated. And if you're Hamas in particular, the fact that the Saudis were making it very clear that they were going to be demanding dividends for the Palestinians, even of this right-wing Netanyahu government, that was not a positive thing for Hamas. This is a very, very negative thing for Hamas. Again, because Hamas is not about a two-state solution. Anything that's going to create a dynamic where a two-state solution, progress in that direction is possible, is anathema to Hamas. And they recognize that if it were to happen, the elements of the Palestinian community that would be sidelined would be the most hardline, the most jihadist, them, Hamas. Today, things between Israel and Hezbollah in the north are very tense. And even just this past weekend, you saw a sharp escalation in attacks from either side. Hezbollah, however, is trying to slowly climb the escalation ladder in baby steps. It does not want a full-scale war with Israel. It does not want to invite the Israeli retaliation that it knows would come. And there are several reasons for this. One, Lebanon has been suffering for some time now from a very, very deep and destabilizing political crisis, and even more so from a very severe economic crisis. Nobody in Lebanon, except for the most hardcore Hezbollah fighters, want war with Israel. They're very eager to have opportunities to fire rockets and do small-scale things that can stay below the threshold of initiating full-scale Israeli retaliation and war. And they're willing to take risks there. One rocket goes just a little bit too far or hits a kindergarten or a hospital in Israel. I guarantee you the Israelis are not going to sit back, and Nasrallah knows that. But under these conditions, they are willing to assume some of those risks. They are doing things to mitigate them. So one of the first anti-tank guided missile shootings that Hezbollah did, they fired an anti-tank guided missile at an Israeli military vehicle that they knew was empty. More recently, they've been allowing Hamas, which has fighters in southern Lebanon, to fire rockets even deeper into Israel than Hezbollah has itself, because this gives them some, reasonable deniability. Now, Hamas can't operate in this space without Hezbollah's okay. The likelihood that Hamas has rockets of these types of its own and that they didn't come from Hezbollah's arsenal is basically nil, but it gives them a little bit of maneuverability. Hezbollah now is clear is doing some other things too. Brazilian authorities, with assistance from both the FBI and Israeli intelligence, just thwarted what they believe as a Hezbollah plot to carry out attacks targeting Jewish or Israeli targets in Brazil, possibly using Brazil as a launching pad to elsewhere in Latin America. It's not entirely clear because the judge has sealed the file, but at least 3 people have already been arrested. And the prospects of Hezbollah doing this type of thing, trying to carry out attacks abroad, which have even greater reasonable deniability, because if a rocket is fired from Lebanon, whether it's Hamas that fires it or someone else, it's clearly fired from Lebanon. It's fired from space that Hezbollah controls. I guarantee you the Israelis hold Hezbollah accountable, and they're not striking back at Hamas, which is the lesser actor there. They're striking back at Hezbollah. And therefore, the possibility of seeing other types of international terrorist attacks is frighteningly real in the moment. All of this, however, has to be taken with a grain of salt. None of us who study Hamas and Hezbollah, which I have for years, I wrote the books, none of us saw what happened on October 7th coming. And Hamas even told us it was going to. Salah al-Aruri, the Deputy Secretary General of Hamas, now based out of Lebanon, he gave an interview on a Hezbollah-affiliated television channel in August, this summer. And he said, look, you need to listen to me. We are preparing for a regional war. I heard it. Intelligence analysts heard it. And we all took it as, tough talk. And apparently it wasn't just tough talk. We all need to seriously reconsider our basic assumptions and reassess our paradigms. So when I tell you that Hezbollah probably won't escalate and probably doesn't want a war, I think that logic stands. But what if Hezbollah starts really believing its rhetoric? What if the fighting for Israel takes a turn for the worst and Israel seems on its back foot and Nasrallah says, you know what, this really is the time to get involved. If we get involved now, this really could be the end of Israel. Or what if the fighting continues to go well for Israel and Israel really is on the cusp of dislodging Hamas from Gaza? Will Hezbollah, will Iran sit back and not do very much and lose one of its primary proxies and their base? There are other factors. All of those rockets that Hezbollah has, they have another purpose, and that is to deter Israel, or for that matter, other countries, from striking Iran's nuclear program. And if Israel or others do strike Iran's nuclear program, to serve as a second strike capability. Iran has an interest in telling Hezbollah, look, we'd love to be able to destroy Israel, but don't use up too many of your rockets right now. They're all in a little bit of a conundrum. My assessment is that we're going to see very small-scale escalation. Hezbollah wants to demonstrate that it's being tough, but it's not going to do much more than it's doing already. But I'll be the first to tell you I could be wrong. There are many ways that this can go south. This is a very, very sensitive conflict. If it only turns out that little Hamas only brings this region to the cusp of regional war, it will certainly be bad enough. If it's only the destruction that Gazans are suffering because of the actions of Hamas, that'll be enough. But it could get much worse. And there's lots of ways people can miscalculate and hit the wrong target and develop a regional war. Houthis in Yemen have been firing ballistic missiles at Israel. Some shot down by the Israelis, some shot down by U.S. maritime forces, some shot down by the Saudis, some landing in Egypt. There's talk of the Iraqi Shia militias getting involved. There's talk of militias in Syria getting involved. There have been rockets fired at Israel from Syria. There are lots of ways that this can get worse. In the moment, however, there seems to be an element of balancing that's happening, not quite balanced, but of balancing where the actors want there to be hostilities, they want there to be tensions, but they don't want to be at the receiving end of a full-fledged war. They want to position themselves so that they'll be in a good place when the dust settles. And what that looks like, even I am not willing to venture a guess at the moment. I wish I could be with you in person and have Q&A and discussion. Frankly, that's the most interesting part for me. I've given you my email address, and I welcome you to reach out. Jeffrey, thank you very much for reaching out. Danube Institute, thank you for holding this conference and allowing me to be a part of it. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.